y'all, I'm Gina with Thread Graffiti, and the Fat Quarter Shop asked me to come in and show y'all how I made the planner cover for the 2022 Lori Holt planner. The Fat Quarter Shop was celebrating their birthday, and I made this for Kimberly. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to make this one, although you can customize it to cover a composition book or a lot of other books. And first, I'm going to show you how to make this, and then we'll talk about some details on how we can personalize it so it's special just for you. So the first step when we're going to make the planner cover is to quilt your piece. And I cut my piece larger than it needs to be while I'm doing the quilting portion of it. So the ones that I'm going to show you here have already been quilted on my long arm. If you do not have a long arm, you can definitely quilt these at home on your home machine. This is a great way for you to practice doing free motion, straight line quilting. Because these are such small pieces, you can just have a variety of options and really have some fun with it to try to do all different sorts of free motion quilting and line designs. So when you're starting to do the quilting part of this, it's a really great way to either use your scraps or you can use some small packages of batting. And so I really love that the Fat Quarter Shop stocks a square pack. It is a 14 by 14 pre-cut piece, and it's perfect for some of your smaller planners. This is a really cool tool that you can just buy a packet and it's all cut and ready for you. So that's awesome. And then you can also use some of the smaller packs that are 36 by 36, and you can piece them together. One of the fun things that I like to do if I'm piecing batting is there is a fusible tape that comes in a roll. It is really just like the interfacing that you use on like the back of a t-shirt quilt if you're making a t-shirt quilt, and it comes in a strip. And so you can just put your two pieces of batting together and you just roll your tape across and you use your iron, and then I usually flip that piece over and then put another piece of the fusible tape on the back side and press that with your iron, and it holds it. And it's a really great way to use up some of your scrap pieces. You can use this for small projects or even in some large projects if you run into an oopsie on a large quilt. So now we get to my favorite part, the fun part. The part where we get to customize the front of it so that it looks how you want it. You can do free motion quilting, you can do straight line quilting, you can use some of the variety of different types of templates to do different designs, and it's really cool. I'll show a couple of thoughts. This one was quilted on my long arm, and it's the rose that Kimberly loves, and so I did it. It's not a super small, but it's not super big. But it would also be really great if you did straight lines from corner to corner and just leave them so that it's all straight lines. It would be great if you did straight lines this way, and then you also turned and did it this way, and so it would just make a diagonal crosshatch. You could do just straight lines where you do a line and then another line. You could do squares that are, just in various places where you're just kind of free motioning some squares. You can do that same thing with circles. The possibilities are endless. I do also want to show you a tool that I use throughout the entire process of making these. It is very cool. It's by Clover, and it is a point turner as well as a marking tool. And so you'll use the point turner later after we do some of the sewing parts. The marking tool is really great because you can just mark it, and then when you take it to the sewing machine, you'll be able to see your crease line, and then you can follow that as well. And now we're going to talk about thread. There's always a lot of thinking going into the thread part when you're doing any kind of free motion quilting or quilting at home. When I quilt on the long arm, I use glide thread. I use a 60 weight and a 40 weight. Those are the two that I use all the time. And so glide is primarily used on the long arm. But you can use it for embroidery, you can use it for all different kinds of things. So I encourage you to just practice and try things out and use what feels best for you. And when I use my Juki at home, I always use Aurifil. Here are some colors that we could talk about. If you were going to quilt something that's a dark color or red and you want your thread to really blend, this is an Aurifil. It's a 50 weight and it's red, and it's going to blend really well. If you're using something lighter, any of the low volume tones, I almost always use a cream or a linen, something that's going to blend. I usually try to always blend my thread as well as I can. This particular one, I used a 60 weight thread, and so you can barely even see the thread from far away. And so if that's the look that you're going for, then a 60 weight thread is great. The 50 weight Aurifil is actually going to look very similar to this one. So try it out, practice, and see what you like. But these are what I use. Okay, we're going to talk about measurements at this point, and since we're using a book and we're kind of making a custom measurement, what I'm telling you is not going to necessarily mean exactly what you have to do. So you have a little bit of flexibility, and I'm going to show you how you can customize this to whatever book that you're making. Okay, so now we're going to talk about putting it all together. So this is the back side of the fabric, and this is the front side. So this is the side that we're actually going to see that's going to be wrapped around the planner. You may want to just put your planner in there and kind of check it out, make sure. But at this point, what I have is it is 14.5 by 10.5. And so we're gonna trim that down so it doesn't have to be exact. Mine's a little bit crooked. And then my batting is 15 by 11. So I have a little bit of extra batting around the edge just so that I have a little bit of wiggle room. And then the liner is gonna be 14.5 by 10.5. If you see right here, my cut isn't even exact, so we're gonna trim it down and then we're gonna put our little flaps in the inside. And our little flaps are going to go like this. Our flaps are 8.5 by 10.5, and then we're gonna fold it and do the seam, and that makes it 4.25 by 10.5. And again, we're gonna trim it down, so if you're just a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, you should be still fine. Okay, so just make sure that your raw edges are gonna go on the outside, and your seam is gonna go on the inside. This piece we fussy cut, and it has a top and a bottom. And so we will talk about how to make sure that we have it going the right way in just a second when we sew it together. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna pin it. I always pin in from the corner so that you're not going to be close to your edges, so that when you're sewing you don't have to take them out or move them. So this is pinning all 3 of the layers together on all 4 corners. And then when we do the bottom is going to be right here because we can see we just talked about this one. And what I would normally do is put a pin going downward a different direction so that I remember, and another pin right there. And so what that is, it's about 4 inches that we're going to leave open so that we can flip it inside out in a minute. So I usually just set the pins the other direction just so that I remember. And then we're going to pin another one kind of in the center, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine. Okay, the first step when I start going to the sewing machine and I start my actual sewing is I'm going to start on this bottom pin. It's going to go into the sewing machine like this, and I start right here on this pin and then I go around. You can start on either side, but I usually start on one of these pins. When I do anything that has to be flipped inside out, I always back stitch at the beginning, because when you're flipping it inside out, you're going to be kind of tugging and pulling at it, and you don't want that stitch to come undone because it kind of frays and it makes it a little bit more difficult at the end. So I'm going to start it right here at this pin, and then I'm going to back stitch. And I am going, I'm right at about 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going all the way around. I stop at the end about 1/4 of an inch. You have to remember that you made this flap just a little bit longer, so we'll talk about making sure you got all of it included in just a second. Okay, and this pin right here is reminding me that I need to stop and back stitch again. So like we talked about, we're gonna leave that part open so we can take our pins out now. I don't usually trim it yet at this point until I make sure that you caught all your edges, because I have flipped it inside out before and realized that I missed, like a portion of it. So just make sure that you kind of got all your seams, see like that, where you see the red, so you know that you got all of the layers in there. What we're gonna do is we're gonna trim it all down, and we're gonna trim it and then we're gonna cut off the corners. But what I usually do is I flip it inside out first, because I wanna make sure that it's gonna be the right size before I go cutting it and trimming it and all that. So I took that hole and I just am flipping it inside out. I usually pull from one corner and then I pull from the other corner. And then you just pull that through the hole. It's a little bit weird at first, but that's gonna show you what it's gonna look like. And so I always do this. It's kind of an extra step and it's a little bit of a pain, but I always do it just to make sure that I have it the way that I want it. One of the times that I did it, this seam it didn't catch all 3 of the layers. So it's important to flip it over and just kind of look. And I'm just using my fingers right now to poke it through. And that's why I usually make it about 3 or 4 inches so I can get most of my fingers and my hands in there. So that's what your inside is gonna look like, and that's what the outside, and you may think, uh-oh, I did it wrong, but this is gonna be able to flip back over to the other side. The red is the outside, and the green is your flap. And so now we see this is the top and this is the bottom. We're just gonna take our planner and we're just gonna make sure that it is going to be the way that we want it. I usually slip it in there, and when we do the top stitch, you have a little bit of wiggle room in terms of where to do your top stitch. So when you first put it in there, it might seem like it's a little bit big on the edges, but you have to consider the spiral binding in the center because it is gonna kind of pull. And when the first time that you put it on there, you're gonna have to do a little bit of wiggling and maneuvering. I now see that I have enough room right here to make sure that I do my top stitch. And I don't do the top stitch in very far. I keep it very, very close to the edge. But that's what it's gonna look like. Okay, so what we're gonna talk about right now is maybe you didn't make your measurements exactly how you want it, and maybe it's just a little bit too big and you're like, I don't really wanna leave it like that. So it's very easy, that's why I always flip it out to check it. And what you need to do is just flip it back, trim it down just a little bit more, and then you can just do your stitch over again. So right now we're gonna flip it back because we're gonna trim it anyway. Okay, so if you happen to make it just a smidge too big and you want to trim it down, all you'd need to do is just follow this seam that you've already done and make it just a hair smaller. I mean, like just almost where you're touching the same seam. You know, I wouldn't do too far, but you can just follow that seam and make it just a little bit smaller, and that'll make it a little bit more snug if that's how you want it. So I'm happy with the way that it is right now, and see how that happens when you start to pull it inside out. I always kind of press it, and you want to try not to really pull on it. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to trim it down, and I'm going to take the ruler and the rotary cutter. You don't even have to leave it at 1/4 of an inch. If you want to make it a little bit less, you can, because you're just going to fold it and top stitch it, and so if you want less bulk, it's okay. I'm going to leave it at just a little bit less than 1/4, and this part kind of makes a mess. And then we're going to trim this side down. And since you're trimming through 3 layers, it's a little bit, you got to give it a little bit more elbow. And then what I usually do on the corners is I just snip just a little bit off the very, very edge. And that makes it easier when you're turning it inside out, so you don't have quite so much bulk on the corners. Just make sure that you don't cut into your seam. Now let's flip it over. Okay, so the next part that I usually do is I always iron it, because if you see this spot where we've done the inside out portion, it just gets a little bit frayed, and so I want to make that flat. It will make the outside of your planner look better when you go to do the top stitching, and when you close it. See how it looks so much flatter. So make sure you take a nice hot iron to it when you're doing this part, because it will really show up in your end result. Okay, so now we're gonna turn it back inside out, and this time I'm gonna be a little bit more careful. As you're doing this final step, the less you pull on that spot, probably the better. So then I go up to the other corner. I just do the top right corner and the top left corner, is probably because I'm right-handed, and then I'm gonna use my turner. I usually just put my hands in there first, and make sure that you put your flaps on the inside. Okay, so there's that side. Flip that back over, and I'm just using my fingers right now. I'm gonna take the little turner. I just really kind of gently poke at it so that your corner is good and perfect. And if you don't have one of these turners, a little trick is you can take a pin. I usually use one that's a little bit thicker than this, but you can kind of poke at the corner and push it out just a little bit. It'll kind of pull that edge out so that it gives you a more curved edge. Same thing with this one. The more time that you spend on this just kind of getting it perfect, it'll just look better when it's folded over when you do your top stitch. And so now we are going to press it, and then we're going to do the top stitching. Okay, so the pressing part is kind of important right now because it just will make your outside edge look nicer. What I usually do is kind of pull like that and then push my fingers forward to kind of get a nice good edge on it. So pull it back and then kind of push it, because when you do your top stitch, you probably don't want to see your backing fabric on there. What I mean by that is when you do your top stitch, when you fold it over, if you don't do a good job, you might have some green showing from the front. And so if that's okay with you, then that's fine. But if you don't want any of that showing, just kind of use your fingers and pull it back. Okay, we're just gonna keep going all the way around. And I usually just do the outsides first just to make sure that I have it the way I want it. And you can flip it over and just kind of check. All the corners look okay, and so now we're going to talk about this part. And what I do is just kind of press it down and then flip this part in and this part in. And I always kind of press it to get it where I want it. So initially just kind of press it and get it flipped back, and then you can kind of fine tune it with your pins. So if you see from this side, you see how it's kind of curved, and so what we want to do now is push it in so that it lays flat from the outside, and then press it again. You can use pins or wonder clips or whatever you feel comfortable using. And then I usually kind of maneuver a little bit when I get it on the machine when I'm doing the top stitch. I just kind of use my fingers and get it nice and straight. Now, there's always going to be a little bit of the thread from when you did the top stitch right there. So just kind of poke it in when you're doing the top stitch. And then I close that up with the top stitch. So I'm not going to stitch it right now. I'm going to wait to take it to the machine. We're going to do the top stitch all the way around. That'll close up the hole, and then we'll be ready to go. Okay, we're taking it to the sewing machine, and I just wanted to mention that when I start, I usually start right here where the flap meets the bottom, so that the seam is down on the bottom, where your start and your stop is down on the bottom, and it's kind of nestled in. So that's where I usually start, and then I go really, really slow in the beginning. I'm very, very, very close to the edge, so I'm definitely not 1/4 of an inch in. However, when you were making yours, if you planned for a nice big top stitch, then that's okay. So this part is really kind of personal preference, however you want it and however you made it, but I'm doing mine very, very close to the edge. When I go around the corner, I don't go to the edge and stop and pivot and turn. I just kind of continue with the rounded shape rather. So I just do a couple of stitches and then kind of stop and pivot. I guess I also want to mention that if you wanted to stitch it from the other side, you can do that as well, so you can see the way that your top stitch is going to look. I just usually stitch from the inside, but it is an option if you wanted to load it like this and stitch it with the top side showing. So it doesn't have to be done this way. This is just the way I prefer. And there we are. Isn't it cute? At this point, you might want to trim your little threads from your start and your stop. You can also give it a little press if you want to, pull your little threads off and that kind of thing, but it's ready. And so we're just gonna tuck in our planner. This planner is so cute. I usually just pull up the top so you can get it in there, and it should be a nice snug fit. And then just a little bit of wiggling. And how cute is that? Okay, and so now I'm going to show you how to personalize them and do some fun little things that make it all your own. This one I made using the Farm Girl Vintage 2 book. This particular block is right here. It's on the front. It's the zinnia. It's on page 23, but there's tons of fun ideas because all of Lori's books have the 6-inch blocks. This, I just made the 6-inch block, and I added a top piece and a bottom piece, and I added a side piece. So you look at it from this way, and I just added in some pieces. I didn't do a lot of measuring. I just made sure that it was over that 14.5 like we talked about so we could trim it down. When I started to do this, I was folding it and I was trying to make sure that it was centered the way that I wanted. And I got a phone call and I started talking on the phone, and I got it, and I took my rotary cutter and I cut it right off the side. And then I folded it again and I was like, oh my gosh, I did it wrong. I cut it off wrong. So what I did was I actually used the fusible tape that we talked about before. I cut a little tiny strip, I cut it in half. And so I just put that little piece on the back side, and I pressed it with the iron, and then I put another little piece on the top side and pressed it with the iron. And then I used some of Lori Holt's vintage trim, which is adorable, and I put it right over there and I stitched it so that my two pieces were back together. So it's kind of a cute little addition, but it was definitely not on purpose. And then since I used it on the back, I definitely had to add it to the front so that it looks like it was an intentional thing. So I just want to remind you, if you make a mistake, there's always a way to fix it with sewing, and just have fun with it. So these little 6-inch blocks, you can use tons of them. If you weren't going to use the binder, you can also use a composition book. What I did with this one, it's exactly the same technique that I just showed you. I just measured my composition book, added about 3/4 of an inch all the way around in my initial measurement, and then did exactly the same thing that I just showed you in the video. So these are very easy to customize. We just did that, and if you notice, I think actually this side might even be shorter than this side. So don't worry about making some mistakes. Make it your own. And so this one I used 2-inch squares. I think it was 80 something 2-inch squares, and I just joined them together, and then I put this on the long arm, and I did a bubble pantograph that kind of matched the bubbles that were in the fabric. This one's super cute. So you don't have to use just, one big piece. You can do some piecing and add in some fun varieties and some trim and all kinds of stuff. So have fun with it. So this project is a lot of fun, and I hope you make some and enjoy it and just really do a lot of fun things. I can't wait to see y'all show them. And I do also want to mention on the composition books that I used to always make these for my son's teachers when he was younger as a teacher, a gift. You could use a Cricut and you could add in their name. I often would make a bookmark, just a small little piece of fabric with a ribbon on the end, and you can put their name on that too. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you subscribe to the Fat Quarter Shop if you don't already. And you can find me, my name is Gina, and you can find me at threadgraffiti.com, and I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks a bunch. Have a great day.